You don't even pay rent here. What more do you want?" I stood frozen in the living room. Lisa's voice rang out, sharp and clear, slicing through the air like a blade, not because it was loud, but because it was true. Brutally, devastatingly true. I turned to look at James, my son, the boy who once clung to my legs when he had a fever, who used to cry for me in the night. He just stared at the floor, silent. No defense, no protest. His silence was even louder than her words, and in that moment, I saw it all so clearly. I wasn't a mother, I wasn't family, I was a guest, a freeloader, an unpaid babysitter with no right to ask for anything in return. My name is Evelyn. I'm 60 years old, a widow, a retired nurse. I spent more than 3 decades caring for others, patients by day, my husband by night. My hands have held dying strangers, and my heart has carried the pain of watching loved ones fade away. I used to think I was built for sacrifice. But now I wonder if I just never learned how to say enough. After my husband passed, the house felt cold and hollow. James suggested I move in. "You'll be happier with us, Mom," he said. Lisa nodded, smiling sweetly. "We'll treat you like family." I believed them, every word. I packed one suitcase, left the home I shared with my husband, and brought with me the last pieces of a life I had given my all to. A few clothes, some medicine, faded photos, and my faith in family. At first, I did everything without being asked. I cooked, cleaned, watched the baby. I didn't mind, it felt good to help, but soon those tasks weren't appreciated. They were expected. Lisa never said thank you. James started saying things like, "You're home all day anyway." I slept on the living room sofa. I had no room of my own. Each morning I folded my blanket, put everything away before anyone else woke up. My things were stuffed in an old suitcase hidden behind the cabinet. There was no space in that house that belonged to me. Not a corner, not even a chair. One day, I asked if I could visit an old friend that weekend. Lisa raised an eyebrow and said, "So, who's going to watch the kids?" Her tone was casual, but her eyes were cold. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The words just vanished from my throat. I remembered the nights I stayed up watching over her after childbirth, and now a simple outing required permission. That's when I started looking in the mirror differently. The woman staring back at me was pale, hunched, worn thin. Who was she? Where had Evelyn gone? The woman who used to smile when a patient recovered. The mother who whispered to her child, "I'll always be here for you." I love my son. I adore my grandchild. But somewhere along the way, I stopped loving myself. I had become invisible, useful, but unseen, needed, but not respected. I wasn't a mother anymore. I was a tool, a silent, reliable, unpaid presence, something convenient, something free. And that sentence, "What more do you want?" was the final crack that broke me. I stood there, holding back tears, pretending I didn't hear the echo of those words inside my chest. But deep down, something had shifted. Something inside me whispered, "No more." It was time to choose. Fade into the background and survive quietly. Or rise and reclaim the life I gave away too easily. I used to believe that unconditional love was a mother's greatest strength, that if I just gave enough, one day they would look back and be grateful. But I was wrong. So very wrong. It all started with what seemed like a harmless request. "Mom, we're thinking of fixing the house. You've probably noticed, the roof leaks and the bedroom's always hot. Could we maybe borrow some of your retirement savings? Just for now. We'll pay you back." I didn't even hesitate. How could I say no to my own child? James promised to pay me back in monthly installments. Lisa even printed out a little agreement, just a few vague lines on a scrap of paper. No signature, no witness, nothing formal. I smiled and said, "That's not necessary. I trust you." And I did. I trusted them with the heart of a mother who had lived her whole life for her family. But months passed, no repayment, no discussion. When I brought it up gently, Lisa muttered, "It's a tight time right now?" James quickly changed the subject. Eventually, it was as if the promise had never existed at all. It wasn't the money that hurt the most. It was the realization that I wasn't a mother in their eyes anymore. I was a resource, something to tap into when needed, a quiet pool of savings they could draw from without guilt. I'd worked for every single one of those dollars, long hospital shifts, overtime nights, holidays spent with strangers instead of family. I skipped vacations, wore old clothes, counted every coin. That money was meant to be my safety net, my dignity in old age. One afternoon, I opened my old savings book and saw the dwindling balance. Just a few hundred left. I stared at those numbers as my eyes filled with tears, not from need, but from betrayal, from realizing that the people I sacrificed everything for saw my life's work as theirs to spend. I remembered the early days of my career, a young nurse in a crisp white uniform, newly married, juggling syringes and diapers. I remembered sitting up with my husband when he burned with fever. I remembered James breaking his arm when he was 8, how I wept as I wrapped his little limb in a cast. Those memories are carved into me. But for them, it's like they never existed. This house grows tighter by the day, not because of furniture, but because of how small I'm made to feel in it. Every meal feels like a meeting I'm not invited to. Conversations carry on around me, but never include me. They plan vacations without asking, rearrange the furniture without telling me. I'm not consulted. I'm not considered. I realized I'm no longer seen as an elder. I'm just Evelyn, the old lady who happens to live here, convenient when help is needed, invisible when she speaks. Some nights I lie awake, fingering the edges of our faded wedding photo. In it, I am young, bright-eyed, hopeful. The man beside me is gone now, and the child born from that love treats me like a monthly expense to be managed through silence. I used to think, if I just stay quiet, things will get better. But no. Every time I stayed silent, they pushed further. Every time I sacrificed, they took more. The more I tried to hold us together, the more I was pulled apart. And then it hit me. Maybe I helped build this cage myself, by saying yes too easily, by giving too much without setting limits, by being too afraid to ask for anything in return. That afternoon, the sunlight fell in broken streaks across the tiled floor. I had just placed a bowl of porridge on the table when Lisa walked in, eyes glued to her phone, her face blank. I cleared my throat gently, trying to sound casual. "I was thinking of visiting my old friend Mai this weekend. It's been so long, and she just had a mild stroke. I thought I'd stop by for a bit." Lisa didn't even look up. Her voice was flat, automatic. "Going out? Then who's going to watch the kids?" I smiled faintly, trying to explain. "I'd leave early, be back by the afternoon, just one day. I haven't seen her in over 30 years. I just need—" James stepped out of the room then, his brow furrowed. "Why didn't you say something earlier, Mom? We already have plans this weekend." I hesitated. "I only found out this morning. I didn't want to trouble you." That's when Lisa finally looked at me. Her arms crossed, voice calm but icy. "You live here rent-free. What more do you want?" Silence, heavy, suffocating. That sentence fell like a stone in the middle of the room. I stared at her, stunned. The words echoed in my ears. "Rent-free. What more do you want?" like I was some freeloader who'd overstayed her welcome. James didn't say a word. He didn't defend me. He didn't even flinch. His silence hurt more than the sentence itself. I turned away. My hands were trembling slightly. "I see," I said softly. I returned to the corner of the living room, my so-called space. The sofa where I slept every night, the couch that creaked beneath my aging back, that I folded up every morning before anyone else woke. I sat down, but I didn't cry. The tears stayed stuck somewhere between my chest and my throat. Instead, I reached for my old suitcase tucked behind the cabinet and pulled out a worn notebook. Inside were yellowed pages filled with crooked handwriting, records from another lifetime. James took his first steps, 11 months. James broke his arm, cried for 3 hours. James said I was a superhero, age 5. Each entry felt like a thread being pulled loose from a tapestry. I had sewn every piece of our family together with quiet dedication. And now that same tapestry was being unraveled by the very people I had wrapped in its warmth. I remembered working double shifts when James was in college. I remembered tending to my husband through years of illness. I remembered cradling Lisa's firstborn so she could sleep. Never once had I asked for anything in return. But today, I had asked for one thing, one quiet day to see an old friend. And I was met with, "You live here rent-free." That sentence didn't just hurt. It erased me. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I sat there in the dim light. I looked up at our wedding photo. A much younger me stared back, smiling with eyes full of hope. And beside her, the man I loved, now long gone. I whispered to the photo, "Do you see this? Our son. He doesn't need me anymore. Worse, I think he's forgotten who I ever was." It wasn't grief that filled me. It was something colder, something sharper, not sorrow, but clarity. For the first time in years, I didn't cry out of hurt. I cried because I finally saw myself for who I had become, invisible, overused, muted. Not because they made me that way, but because I had allowed it. I had stayed quiet too long, given too much too easily. And now I was no longer Evelyn the nurse, the wife, the mother. I was just someone who slept on the couch. But somewhere in the hollow silence of that night, something stirred. Not anger, not revenge. Something quieter, but more powerful. Resolve. I placed my hand on my chest. My heart still beat. I was still alive, and that meant one thing. I still had a choice. I stood and looked into the mirror. The woman staring back at me was tired, wrinkled, worn, but her eyes held something new, something fierce, and I heard a voice rise from within me, steady and unshakable. "Evelyn, that's enough. Starting tomorrow, you live for yourself." I had grown used to carrying everything in silence, doing without asking, enduring without complaint. I used to tell myself that as long as I kept giving, things would eventually get better. But after hearing those words, "You live here rent-free, what more do you want?" I had nothing left to tell myself. That night, after the hallway lights dimmed and the TV fell silent, I stayed awake on the old sofa, curled beneath a thin blanket. My fingers clutched the edge of my notebook as if it could anchor me to a version of life that once made sense. I stared into the darkness, still, cold, empty. There were no more tears left, just a dull, persistent ache in my chest, like a wound too deep to bleed. I stood up and walked to the bathroom. The small mirror above the sink reflected a tired, worn-out woman, with sunken eyes and sagging cheeks. I hadn't really looked at myself, really looked, in a long, long time. I stared into my own eyes, and for the first time, I didn't see a helpless old woman. I saw a survivor, a woman who had walked through decades of sacrifice and storm, who was still standing, not untouched, but unbroken. I whispered, "Evelyn, you're still here, still alive. And if you're alive, you can still change." I didn't know what the future would look like, but I knew that if I kept living like this, I would fade quietly into invisibility. And I was not ready to disappear. The next morning, I started searching, quietly, carefully. I pulled out my old phone, connected it to the Wi-Fi, and opened the browser. Every tap was slow, my fingers not as nimble as they once were. My eyes strained to read the small text, but I kept going. I typed, "Senior Citizen Legal Rights Vietnam." Then, "Free legal aid for elderly." Then, "Housing programs for independent, older adults." Page after page, I read, I took notes. My notebook began to fill again, not with memories of others, but with ideas for myself. I rested when my eyes grew tired, but I always went back, because this was my first step, a small one, but it was mine. I remembered a patient once asking me, "Weren't you ever afraid, caring for someone on their deathbed?" I had answered, "Yes," but what scared me more was the thought of someone dying without being seen, as a person. And now I realized I was dying in a different way, not physically, but spiritually, slowly, quietly, forgotten, and I couldn't allow that to continue. I found a nonprofit that supported older women facing emotional neglect or dependency. I saved the phone number, my hands trembled, my heart pounded. The next day, after James and Lisa had left for work, I dialed the number. My voice shook, but I spoke clearly. "My name is Evelyn. I need guidance. I don't want to live like this anymore." On the other end was a young woman. Her voice was warm, steady, kind. She listened without rushing, without judgment. When I finished, she said gently, "Miss Evelyn, you are not alone. We'll walk with you, one step at a time." I put the phone down and exhaled. Something stirred in me, not blind hope, but something more grounded, a sense of movement, of agency. For the first time in years, I felt like I was steering again. I walked back to the mirror. The woman staring back at me hadn't changed overnight. But now, she had something in her eyes I hadn't seen in a long time. Light. Change didn't begin with shouting. It didn't begin with tears or ultimatums. It began in silence. Quiet. Intentional. Like the first shift in the wind before a storm. Each morning, I still rose early, still cooked, still changed diapers and folded blankets, but something inside me had changed. I wasn't doing it out of fear anymore. I wasn't trying to keep the peace. I did it because I chose to for now, until I could leave. I opened a small notebook and divided it into 3 sections: housing, finances, legal help. I called back the woman from the support organization. She connected me with a volunteer lawyer, a man who specialized in helping senior women navigate situations like mine. 2 days later, I took a bus to a small office across the city. Sitting on a creaky wooden bench in the hallway, I felt my heart race like it used to before exams. The lawyer was middle-aged, wore glasses, and had a calm, respectful demeanor. He listened patiently as I told him everything, about the money they borrowed with no written contract, the emotional neglect, the way I had become invisible in my own son's home. He nodded slowly. "To be honest, Miss Evelyn," he said, "without formal paperwork, recovering that money will be difficult. But you're right to make decisions about where you live, what you own, and how you're treated. That remains intact. You still have the right to live with dignity." I nodded, not in bitterness, but in clarity. I had known it already. But sometimes you just need someone else to say it out loud. I began looking for places to live. At first, just online. A small ground-floor apartment in a complex for independent seniors. affordable, with just enough left in my savings to manage. It had a little balcony, and morning sunlight streamed through the windows. I stared at the pictures, heart pounding, not because it was beautiful, but because it was mine, a space where I could exist fully. That Friday, I went to see the apartment in person. The manager was an older woman with soft eyes and silver hair who told me stories as she walked me around. I stood in the middle of the empty room, looked up at the ceiling, then out the window at a lush green tree swaying in the wind. I said nothing, but inside I knew. This is where I begin again. Back home, I started planning. I made a list of the things I would take with me and what I would leave behind. I decided to sell some old jewelry, not out of desperation, but because I wanted to travel light. I didn't need to carry every piece of the past, just what made me stronger. I didn't tell James or Lisa. I didn't hint. I didn't ask for permission. They didn't need to prepare. They just needed to understand I was no longer theirs to manage. That night, once everyone was asleep, I opened my laptop and wrote an email to a small moving company. I scheduled the date, confirmed the time. Saturday morning, 10 a.m. I drew a line in my notebook. Move out date, Saturday, 10 a.m. One line, but the first of an entirely new chapter. I didn't feel afraid. I didn't feel guilty. I felt light. For the first time in years, I felt this truth settle over me like a warm blanket. I had the right to choose. I had the right to leave a place that no longer felt like home, and seek one that did. I sat down and opened my to-do list. At the very top, in strong, clear handwriting, I wrote, "I'm not running away. I'm returning to myself." I had rehearsed it in my mind 100 times. I'm moving out. But saying it in my head and saying it out loud, face to face with your own children, are two entirely different things. One speaks from logic, the other bleeds from a cracked heart. That night after dinner, I walked into the living room. James sat glued to his phone. Lisa was wiping down the table, expression unreadable, as always. I stood before them, hands clasped, fingers cold. "James, Lisa, I need to talk to you." They both looked up, mildly surprised. I didn't wait. "This Saturday, I'll be moving out. I've already rented a small apartment. Everything's arranged." Silence. Lisa blinked a few times as if struggling to process. James sat upright, phone forgotten. "Wait. What? You're moving out? Where? Why?" I kept my voice steady, though my heart pounded. To a place where I can breathe, where I'm not seen as a burden, where I don't feel like an extra. Lisa let out a dry laugh, half disbelief, half dismissal. "You're serious? You're not young anymore, you know. How do you expect to live alone?" I met her eyes without flinching. "I've lived alone most of my life, Lisa. You just never noticed. I raised James by myself while caring for his sick father. I've cooked, cleaned, babysat without rest for the past 2 years. I don't fear solitude. I fear being invisible in a place I once called home." James exhaled, his tone uneasy. "Mom, this feels so sudden. Is this about what Lisa said the other day? Are you still upset?" I shook my head slowly. "No, James, I'm past anger. What's left now is clarity. If I don't stand up for myself, no one else will, not even my own child." Lisa crossed her arms, clearly annoyed. "So what? You just walk away? Who's going to take care of the kids? Cook, clean? You expect us to just manage?" "Yes," I said simply. "The way I managed for years without help. You can hire help. You can learn to rearrange your life. I'm not your maid. I'm not your free nanny. I am your mother." James rose to his feet and took a step forward. His eyes were filled with concern and something that looked like regret. "But, Mom, it feels like you're abandoning us." I looked at him, the boy I once rocked to sleep, who clung to my leg when scared, now standing here, confused, unsure, like a child again. I'm not abandoning anyone, son. I'm just choosing to stop abandoning myself. Lisa scoffed, but her voice trembled slightly. So, what about the money? The retirement fund? Are you planning to ask for it back now? From my pocket, I pulled out the old slip of paper, the so-called agreement they had once written. No signature, no binding power, just memories. I laid it gently on the table. Number, I'm not going to sue. I'm not even going to demand repayment. But if you mean what you said back then, create a plan. Pay it back when and if you can. And if not, let it be the final gift I give to this family. I will not bring it up again. Silence blanketed the room, the kind of silence that doesn't just fill space. It presses on the skin, on the lungs, on the soul. I looked at them, one with his head bowed, the other turned away, and realized I wasn't just leaving a house. I was leaving behind a version of myself I no longer recognized. I'm not leaving out of anger, I said. I'm leaving because I finally understood existing isn't the same as living. Living means being respected, and that's what I'm choosing for the rest of my life. James rubbed his eyes. Lisa said nothing. I turned, each step deliberate. Not triumphant, not joyful, but free. Each footfall echoed with something I had long forgotten: worth. I paused by the sofa, my makeshift bed for the past 2 years. So many nights I had curled up here, swallowing tears, pretending everything was fine. I ran my hand over the worn fabric and whispered, "Thank you for showing me that I deserve more." That night, I opened my notebook. On the last page, I wrote, "I'm not running away. I'm returning to myself. And this time, I won't ask for permission." Saturday, 9 a.m. I sat quietly on the edge of the old sofa, one last time. The living room looked the same as always. Cartoons humming from the TV, children laughing in the distance, and Lisa's voice trailing from the kitchen in its usual tired tone. But today, I was no longer a ghost. Today, I waited for the moving truck. At 9:55 a.m., my phone buzzed. The driver had arrived. I stood up and took a long breath. James was upstairs. Lisa was busy mixing formula. No one came to see me off. No one asked me to stay. And I didn't expect them to. I walked over to the corner where my suitcase sat, neatly packed since the night before. One suitcase, one fabric bag, a few memories light enough to carry, and heavy enough to remind me why I could never go back. The young driver gave me a respectful nod. He didn't know me, didn't ask questions, and somehow that made me feel seen, not as the old lady who lives with her son, but simply as a person. I stepped into the truck. Through the window, I looked back at the house one last time. No one waved, no one called my name. But I didn't cry. I smiled, softly, quietly, completely. The truck moved. It was a short ride, but for me, it was the farthest journey I'd ever taken. Away from dependency, away from being silenced, away from the version of myself who had survived by shrinking. The new apartment was small, simple, but clean and full of light. A large window opened out to a patch of green trees. The morning sun spilled into the room like a welcome. I opened the window, let the breeze sweep through, and with it, I imagined the dust of the past lifting, one sorrow at a time. I unpacked everything myself, arranged the bed, spread the sheets, set down every item with care. Not because anyone would inspect it, but because this space was mine. I didn't need to ask permission to hang a photo. I didn't need to wait for someone to complain about the smell of jasmine tea or the sound of old French music. That afternoon, I found a small box tucked in the suitcase, a box I thought I'd lost years ago. Inside were a few old coins, a tarnished locket, and a scrap of paper I'd written long ago. It said, "One day, I will live for myself." I had written that note at 42 after a bitter argument with my husband because he wouldn't let me miss one hospital shift to attend a training. I had forgotten all about that note, but now, decades later, I was finally living it. The next day, I called my old friend, Mai, the one I had once tried to visit before being told I was needed to babysit. She wept when she heard my voice. "I thought you'd forgotten me. I never thought I'd hear from you again. Are you okay?" I smiled into the phone. "I'm starting to be. For the first time, from the beginning, on my own terms." That evening, I made a pot of tea, opened an old playlist, and sat alone on the balcony. The streetlights glowed softly. The night was still, so was my heart, not empty anymore, but settled. I took a sip of tea, warm, real, and I thought, I don't need to win over anyone. I just need to win over the version of me who stayed silent yesterday. That morning, I woke up in a place that didn't feel familiar. But I had never felt more like myself. I was no longer mom, no longer grandma, just me. And that was enough. It was my first morning waking up in my new apartment. Sunlight streamed softly through the curtains, no footsteps of little ones, no clinking of dishes, no one calling my name, no one waiting for me to cook, to care, to serve. I wrapped myself in a thin cardigan and brewed a cup of tea. In this kitchen, small, warm, and mine, every spoon, every cup was right where I wanted it. No scribbled notes demanding I babysit, no raised voices behind slamming drawers. I carried my tea out to the balcony. The early morning breeze swept gently through my hair. Familiar, but distant. Familiar, because I used to love the stillness of mornings. Distant, because I had forgotten I once did. I sat on the little rattan chair and took a sip. Jasmine, subtle, warm. For the first time in years, I could hear my own heartbeat, slow, steady, alive. It struck me then. For years I hadn't lived. I'd only endured criticism, endured silence, endured the quiet erosion of self-respect. And now I was reclaiming it, one breath, one moment, one cup of tea at a time. 3 days later, James called. I didn't expect much, but I listened. His voice was quieter than usual. "Mom, I'm sorry. We didn't see you. We didn't hear you. We didn't understand." I let the silence stretch before answering. I was wrong, too. I stayed silent for too long. I thought love meant never saying no. But love without respect isn't love. It's erasure. We didn't talk long, but for the first time in years, it was honest. No guilt, no masks, just truth. I told him, if you want to visit, call first. If you need help, ask, not expect. I'm still your mother. I'll always love my grandchildren. But above all, I am a person, and I matter. That night, I opened a new notebook, sea green cover, smooth, unmarked, clean. On the first page, I wrote, I am not running away. I am returning to myself, and this time, I won't ask for permission. I closed the notebook, looked in the mirror. The woman staring back at me was older, wrinkled, eyes shadowed from years of pushing herself to the side. But now, she smiled. No fear, no apology, just the quiet, powerful conviction that she was finally whole again. If you've ever felt like a stranger in your own home, if you've ever forgotten who you were while trying to be everything for everyone else, please remember, you are not alone, and it is never too late to begin again. Freedom isn't a place. Freedom is the moment you look in the mirror and say, I am me, and I am enough.